Good evening. Welcome to Georgetown and this timely public dialogue on faith and the faithful in this election year. I am John Carr, the founder of the Initiative on Catholic Social Thought and Public Life here at Georgetown. Thanks for so many people coming out on this beautiful evening here in Washington. We're so glad you're here, and we invite you to join us for a reception in the beautiful Riggs Library after the dialogue, and we can continue the conversation. I also want to welcome more than 2,000 people who have signed up to listen to our dialogue online. We believe this kind of turnout shows that there is a hunger for respectful, substantive, and principled dialogue on faith and public life, even in these polarized times. Over the last decade, our initiative has organized 175 of these gatherings and reached more than 350,000 people. So there is a hunger. This context for this dialogue on faith and the faithful in politics is both current and enduring. 23 years ago, our nation was attacked, and thousands of our sisters and brothers perished, some less than 4 miles from here at the Pentagon, and many more at the World Trade Center in New York. Let us pause for a moment in silent prayer for those who lost their lives and those who lost their loved ones on this horrible day. That terrible moment 23 years ago brought our nation together in prayer and common purpose. Sadly, our nation is a long way from that unity and common purpose today. 3 months ago, many of us were in this very same room for a lively dialogue on the vocation of a journalist that had an all-star cast, journalists who were hired or mentored by my brother, David Carr. It was a challenging, it was a moving discussion, and you can find it on our website if you're interested. Since then, not much has happened. It's been sort of a sleepy summer. Jake Tapper went from this stage to 9 days later moderating a dialogue between President Biden and former President Trump. The Biden people thought an early debate would shake up the race, and they were right. There was an assassination attempt on former President Trump. The Republican convention began with the announcement of J.D. Vance as Trump's vice president. Then President Biden withdrew from the race and endorsed Vice President Harris. Then Vice President Harris nominated Minnesota Governor Tim Walz to be her vice presidential running mate. Then the Democrats convened in Chicago. And last night, Vice President Harris and former President Trump debated. To sort all this out, we have a remarkable group of leaders, analysts, and friends of our initiative. We have asked them to offer a sense of where things stand and to examine the often overlooked and sometimes oversimplified role of faith and the faithful in this critical election. So Ram Amari is the founder and editor of Compact Magazine and writes a column for the New Statesman. Previously, he was an editor and writer for New York Post, the Wall Street Journal, and Commentary. His latest book is Tyranny, Inc., How Private Power Crushed American Liberty and What to Do About That. We expect a 2-minute version of that, if we can. He's also the author of Unbroken Thread, Discovering the Wisdom of Tradition in an Age of Chaos, and From Fire by Water, the moving account of his spiritual journey to Catholicism. E.J. Dionne is a professor here at Georgetown in the McCourt School of Public Policy, a columnist at the Washington Post, and a senior fellow at the Brookings Institute. His latest book is 100% Democracy, The Case for Universal Voting. He is the author of Why Americans Hate Politics and Sold Out, Reclaiming Faith in Politics. Many may not know this, but E.J. once covered the Vatican for the New York Times. And he is the author of one of my favorite lines about religion and politics. There is no Catholic vote, and it's really important. Nicole Flores is an associate professor of religious studies at the University of Virginia. Her work focuses on the principles of Catholic social teaching, the relationship between Catholicism and democracy, emphasizing Latina theology, ethics, and politics. She has degrees from Smith College, Yale Divinity School, and Boston College. She is the author of The Aesthetics of Solidarity, Our Lady of Guadalupe, and American Democracy. Two of her most intriguing articles I saw were Mercy as a Public Virtue and In Jefferson's Shadow, Can Catholic Theology Thrive at a Public University? Kristen Soltis Anderson is a pollster, a commentator on CNN, and writes a column for the New York Times. She is the founding partner of Echelon Insights, an opinion research and analytics firm. She was a fellow at Georgetown's Institute of Politics and Public Service. She is the author of Selfie Vote, Where Millennials Are Leading America and How Republicans Can Keep Up. On CNN and in the New York Times, she says data. Well, most of us just share opinions. She also explains with modesty and insight what polls can tell us and what they cannot. This dialogue will be moderated by Kim Daniels, the director of the initiative, who is also a member of the Vatican Dicastery for Communication and was just selected to be an expert for the upcoming October Synod at the Vatican next month. So Kim is responsible for everything important about the Synod, and we'll get back to her on that. She is a great friend, a valued partner, and absolutely the best person to lead the initiative into the future. So Kim.
Thanks, John. Thanks so much for all of that. And thanks to you all for being here with us in person at Georgetown tonight. A special welcome to those of you who are joining us online. We're so excited to be able to have this conversation. We're here tonight to explore the political and religious dynamics of this very tumultuous election year. And as we approach the election, we're very mindful of Pope Francis' focus on the decision to include or exclude those left lying wounded by the roadside, he says, as the criterion for judging every economic, political, social, and religious project. In his warnings about what he calls the global retreat from democracy, Pope Francis also reminds us that the goal of politics is listening and serving people, and that democracy always requires the transition from partisanship to participation, from cheering to dialogue, he says. So this is a very Catholic and Jesuit idea, that dialogue, engaging with others with respect, with humility, across differences, can help us enrich our understanding, learn from each other, and better inform our actions. So in this dialogue here tonight, we hope to reflect the latest political analysis through the lens of our rich and robust tradition of Catholic social teaching, a tradition that at its best hangs together as a unified whole. We'll ask how principles of Catholic social thought, like respect for human life and dignity, a priority for the poor, solidarity and subsidiarity, the dignity of work, and the desire to advance the common good, can inform our political choices in the upcoming election. We'll talk about our responsibilities as faithful citizens in our pluralist democracy, and we'll also discuss the broader impact of faith in the faithful on the election, with the shifting dynamics in Jewish, Muslim, evangelical, and other Christian communities, including the strong influence of the Black church. So that's a lot to talk about, so let's go ahead and get started. Kristen, I'm going to start with you, and I'm going to ask a question for everybody. We'll go around and ask this one question to everybody pretty quickly, and then we'll have a little bit of a longer conversation. So Kristen, what do you think was the most important moment in last night's debate, and why?
Ooh. So last night's debate, before I answer that question briefly, I just want to thank you so much for including me in this discussion. This is an unbelievable panel that I feel very honored to be up here with. I am a Florida Gator, but I am a Hoya by marriage and by the generous adoption of the folks at GU Politics, and so it is wonderful to be in my adopted university home. And so I'm just grateful for everybody who's watching and who's here to listen to us this evening. So last night's debate, I was watching it from a train. I'm a CNN political commentator. I was in New York to do some early discussion, and then they put me on a train to go home. They did not need me to stay and watch the debate in New York. And it was really interesting watching it on the train because I was almost engaged in a Nixon-Kennedy kind of experiment. My video wasn't working very well on the train Wi-Fi, but the audio was perfect. So there were many moments that I missed visually but only could hear audibly. And I feel like in some ways that changed my perception of the debate because so much of the aftermath I saw was commentary on people's facial expressions. What were they saying when their mics were cut? So with the understanding that most of what I got was just the audio, I think the most critical moment for me were the moments where you really felt a trap being laid that Donald Trump just walked right into. For all that we think about him as being very unpredictable, there were moments that just felt so predictable. It was like kind of watching a horror movie where you just know, like, don't run up the stairs, don't run up the stairs. And yet, as soon as she would say something like, well, his crowd size isn't that big, and you thought, I know where this is going. And it did, and it was really the pattern throughout the night where on issues where Donald Trump has a message that really does resonate with an awful lot of voters, be it the economy, immigration, et cetera, he very often sort of took the bait, fell into the trap, and instead of starting his answer on immigration with a very powerful message about border security, he started it by saying, let me just correct the record on crowd size. So for me, if I had to pick a singular moment, it would be that. It was the moment where I realized, oh, we're going to see a lot of traps being laid and fallen into all night. And that's going to distract a lot from what I think should be a more substantive debate about these issues like the economy, like immigration, and so on.
Thank you. How about you, EJ? What do you think was the most important moment?
I want to say a couple things real quickly. First of all, thanks to all of you for being here, both online and in person. There are so many friends in this audience who should be here instead of me, so but it's really good to see all of you. And thank you, Kim and John, for this initiative. I think a lot of people in this room know it, and people online. Catholic social thought is the hidden gem of the Catholic Church. Gem is good, hidden is bad. And the great thing about what you guys have done is brought that out there, the idea that social justice is essential to so many of the other values the church teaches. You cannot have strong family lives without social justice. People disconnect the cart and the horse. You keep them moving in tandem. So thank you for that. And it's a real joy to be on this panel. I have always wanted to meet Sorap, and so it's good to be here. Nicole is awesome, and I've gotten to work with her on a project for the last month, but I only saw her in a little box, so it's delightful to see her. And I do not want to ruin her career as a Republican pollster, so this is just between us. But Kristen is one of my favorite Republican pollsters, and I call her all the time, and she is always smart, and so it's really good to be here. Just on her point about the bait and switch, the Economist magazine on baiting Trump, the Economist magazine had a great line that Kamala Harris's strategy was actually catch and release. She'd bait the hook, she'd catch him, then she'd release him, rebait the hook, and catch him again. And I think it was really remarkable. There are three things I want to say. One, the handshake at the beginning of the debate, when she walked up to him, wouldn't let him just stand there, kind of owned the stage at that point and said, my name is Kamala. And I thought that was a very powerful moment without saying a word. Second, in my blessedly long life, I never expected a presidential candidate to think it was a good idea to win an election to falsely accuse a group of immigrants of capturing puppies and eating them. I just thought that moment, unfortunately, was very revealing, and it's really quite dreadful. The third thing I want to say is I try to be hopeful, and one of the things that struck me, and Harris kept coming back to it at various points, there is actually an agenda out there that does come out of Catholic social thought and that could actually be unifying, because most Republicans and Democrats support the idea of something like the child tax credit. There's been bipartisan work on that. Think elder care is really important and child care is really important, and figuring out ways to pay people enough to attract them to this kind of work that is both good for social justice and good for a public need that is very hard to fill. And so whenever I heard those kinds of words, It made me feel maybe after this election we'll get around to doing some good stuff. In the meantime, we're talking about captured puppies.
Thank you, EJ. How about you, Saurabh? What do you think was the most important moment last night?
I just want to, first of all, again, echo everyone else who's thanked Kim and John for this incredible initiative and for including me in this discussion. I also just want to, just one story about how much I've come to love Georgetown just over this 2 visits that I've had. The first time I just came to have coffee with John, and it was not long after the kind of Gaza encampments had emerged on campuses across the country. And don't worry, I'm not going to open up that Pandora's box, but only to comment that the protest that was in front of the building that's behind John Carroll's statue, I don't know the name.
Ely.
Yeah, Ely. It was just like the perfect image of a student protest in the sense that, obviously there's a legitimate cause that's students have been fired up about, but there was no slogans there that I would think it would make either Jewish or Muslim students uncomfortable, right? It was just very, very sort of civil and thoughtful as far as campus protests go. So I thought this is a very Catholic protest, regardless of its substance. So that's a real credit to Georgetown. On the other hand, it also put me in mind of one of the opening scenes of The Exorcist, because if you remember, it begins with a movie inside a movie where there's a protest being filmed, and I think it's not far from where that was. So that was more discomforting. Anyway, I would just highlight 2 pieces of the debate, both of them kind of Kamala-centric or Kamala Harris-centric. The first was where I think there was a shortcoming. Early on, when she was talking about the economy, she said something like, "And Goldman Sachs endorses my plan." I think that's a mistake because, famously beloved firm Goldman Sachs, its approval shouldn't be the index of whether or not your economic plan is a sound one. But it is also a betrayal of what I think has been interesting about the Biden administration is in so many ways represents an element of continuity with the populism that emerged in the mid-2010s. And an attempt by the center-left establishment in this country, it's a partially successful one, to address the grievances with neoliberal globalization that had sparked that uprising. So then to go back and say Goldman Sachs and Dick Cheney love me, I think were a mistake. Nevertheless, all that said, I mean, the defining moment for me, the one where I've memorized the quote was, and it's very similar to everything else that's been said, was when Trump was like, "No, I never said I didn't lose 2020. I did win 2020." And it was like the scene in Naked Gun, the 3rd movie, where they all the whole nation simultaneously slaps their forehead. And she replied and said, 81 million Americans fired Donald Trump, and he seems not to be able to get over it. I thought that was a lethal line and a just one, right? Because, and it served her purposes, which is to remind everyone of how exhausting he can be. And of course, he ran right into it. And that may be enough to win her the election, but that first point I brought up is more fraught and deserves greater consideration in Democratic circles.
Thank you. How about you, Nicole? We've heard a lot of different options here. What do you think?
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for having me, and thank you to John, to Kim, to everyone here. It is really lovely to be here at Georgetown, in part because I do work at UVA, which is a wonderful place to work, but it is maybe a more complex place to be a Catholic theologian, as John pointed out. I've written about that before. So coming to a Catholic and especially a Jesuit university for me always feels like coming home. So thank you for welcoming me home, even though I didn't marry into the Hoyas, and I am a Boston College Eagle, and we're ranked 24 right now. So, I think what was most important for me last night, and I think that my colleagues here have done a good job of kind of pointing out the strategic importance and significance of some of these moments, but it really comes down to what was left unsaid in terms of some of the things that matter most, not just to me as a Catholic, but to our faith. One thing, as I can say as someone who's a lifelong Democrat, one of the things that I've really valued is an ever-growing commitment to abolishing the death penalty, and that. that plank being removed from the platform. I don't want to be too catastrophic about it, but this isn't something that's being talked about. What's going on there? But for me, the true north for how I evaluate everything that happens in our politics is not, I love all of the punditry, it's really great, it excites me, but it's conversations with my sister who lives in Denver, Colorado. She manages a bar. She is very much the normal, the middle. She's a person who struggles to live out her faith, but desperately wants to. And I always talk to her about these things. And one thing that stood out to me that actually shows an important tension with, not with what Saurabh said, but with some of these neoliberal economic kind of moments in the debate. My sister said, oh my gosh, Nicole, she calls me Nicole, she said, they want to give me $25K to buy a house. They want to bring back that child tax credit for you and for my nephews. Oh my gosh. And just that she was drinking that up as someone who works her tail off day in, day out, like a manager of a bar. And that really captured my attention, that not just that she said those things, but the vehemence with which she expressed a hope that something could be better. And I think that Catholic social thought, and again, I'm up here as a Catholic moral theologian, I'm not a very good pundit, but I want to take that as a moment to reflect, what does our faith have to say, not just to my sister, but to people who are really struggling, who are really trying to make it by, and how can our politics more robustly both include them, but also have more moments that are that breath of fresh air and maybe fewer that are yay Goldman Sachs.
Well, it seems like that's so much of what this election is about, right, is speaking to people who feel left behind. And I wonder, Kristen, I wonder if we can come to you for a few minutes now, just to help us set the context. As John said, you're a respected pollster. You often write about likely voters and what major polls get right and wrong. And we're so grateful that you're here to help us set this context. In light of all of that you've heard so far, in light of what you saw last night, what's the state of the race right now between the two campaigns? What should we look for in the days to come?
So right now this is an incredibly close race, and not just in the way that it's common for pundits to say this, goodness, this race could go one way or the other as a way of kind of hedging their bets and not being caught on the wrong side of an incorrect prediction. It is genuinely, unbelievably razor thin. The last poll that my firm did, we came out of the field and we found that the difference between the vote share for Trump and Harris was 0.2%. Now, we don't report our polls to the 10th place because we think that that's a sort of methodologically inappropriate thing to do. It conveys a level of precision that is not appropriate for what a poll actually does. But when we just look at the raw numbers, it is astonishing to me. And this was echoed over the course of the last week by a number of different polls conducted by different pollsters with different methodologies, different approaches to how they think we can capture the most accurate snapshot of the electorate. Everyone is kind of telling the same story. And this is really a factor of voters on both sides finally becoming more energized about their own side. There had been some asymmetry for a while where Republicans had been much more excited about Donald Trump as their nominee than Democrats had been about Joe Biden. This change at the top of the ticket has meant that Democrats have sort of caught up on the enthusiasm side, if not, in some cases, slightly surpassed Republicans. They're doing better in terms of fundraising. And the Democratic coalition now also is comprised of more voters who are very reliable voters. I started off as a pollster almost 20 years ago, working for EJ and my good friend Dave Winston. As a junior Munchkin pollster, I learned very quickly that when you went from adults to registered voters to likely voters, as you changed the frame of your poll and you got more and more narrow, you tended to get more and more Republican, that the vast majority of people were not majority Republican, but as you got more and more to likely voters, it was. That's different today. The coalitions have changed quite a bit because Donald Trump has brought into the Republican coalition those who were less civically engaged, those who were less socially connected, those who were a little bit more distrustful of social institutions, less likely to engage not just with voting, but with a whole host of other sort of social constructs or social institutions. He brought them into the Republican Party at the same time that he did alienate some who were among the likeliest voters. My colleague Patrick Ruffini has sort of put it that this was like they traded the driving range for the gun range in some ways, that sort of country club type Republicans were pushed out or fled the party at the same time that Donald Trump brought in more working class voters. But that is more of a turnout challenge. And so right now, it's another cliche is to say it all comes down to turnout, but that really is the big question. Democrats have a bunch of voters in their coalition now who are very likely to turn out. And so if they can attach to that groups like younger voters that are a little harder to get to the polls, they will have a very difficult force to stop. At the same time, Donald Trump turns out voters who don't turn out for anyone else. He motivates people both for and against him, but he does bring out people who had never considered voting before. And that has been both a blessing and a curse for the GOP.
Thanks for that. And we're here to talk about faith in the faithful. And I love EJ's line about, there is no Catholic vote, and it's really important. I think that when we get down to these swing states in particular districts, I feel like those are places where these votes for different faith traditions come into play. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about the state of the Catholic vote, the Jewish vote, the Muslim vote, if there is such a thing.
Sure. So I took a look at some of my survey crosstabs from my most recent survey before I walked in here today. And for some of those groups, within any one individual survey, it's hard to get a good read because your sample size is somewhat small. But for groups that were big enough for me to draw conclusions about, there were three. One was sort of white evangelical Protestants. They break very heavily Republican, essentially 80-20. And that was whether you were looking at the generic ballot, which is would you vote Republican or Democrat for Congress, or Harris versus Trump. When we looked at religiously unaffiliated voters, that, by about a 2-to-1 margin, breaks for the Democrats, breaks for Kamala Harris. The Catholic vote was actually this almost perfectly pure swing vote constituency if you consider they were split about 50-50. When we looked at it, Republican, Democrat, the generic ballot question, it really was right down the middle. When the question was Donald Trump versus Kamala Harris, Catholic voters broke, I believe, by 4 points for Donald Trump, but very, very, very closely matched. So it's interesting. We talk about a lot of groups as quote-unquote swing voters. We talk about independents. We talk about suburbanites. But I feel like we don't actually talk about Catholic voters as a swing voter. And when I pulled up that crosstab, I sort of chuckled to myself, oh, this will be a fun number to drop tonight. This will set up the discussion quite well, that really there is a very even division within voters who identify as Catholic.
Well, that's a good way to go to you, EJ. And you've been talking about these issues and writing about them for decades. I think you've long called on Democrats to speak and include in their coalition people whose faith calls them to issues of justice and solidarity and community. When we look back at the Democratic Convention, it looked like it was going to be an Irish wake. Then it became this joyful celebration. Now we have the nomination of Kamala Harris and Tim Walz. How did last night's debate continue or set back these different dynamics? Have Democrats shifted their approach, I think? We see them going from a threat to democracy to a weird old candidate. Is that a good shift? Is that a good way to approach this or an ineffective one? What do you think?
Well, I just want to recount a conversation I had, which is, people were talking about the Democratic Convention being joyful. And I said, well, when you have a near-death experience and then have a miraculous resurrection, then you have a lot of joy. And a friend of mine added brilliantly, and in this case, there was an immaculate conception, which is that Kamala Harris got the nomination without having to fight for it at all. Just to explain the idea, thank you, John, Kim, for always quoting that there is no Catholic vote and it's important. There is no Catholic vote because Catholics for a long time, basically probably since the 72 election, have been a 40-40-20 group. It's very hard for Democrats to fall below 40. It's very hard for Republicans to fall below 40, but there's a lot of swing in it. Secondly, Catholics are very diverse and in a way mirror America. About 10% of the Catholic vote is black, about a third is Latino, and then the rest are various white ethnic groups. And so it means that there are a lot of elements and swingy elements. I love the old-fashionedness of Kamala Harris last night speaking directly to the 800,000 Poles in Pennsylvania about Ukraine in the middle of the debate. I felt like I was back about 40 years ago when I heard that, but I bet the Poles heard her when she said that. And there are a lot of Catholics who are cross-pressured, who are somewhat more conservative on social issues. Abortion, obviously, is the obvious one, but quite progressive, particularly on labor and social justice issues. That's more complicated now, I think, than in the past, but I think that's That's always been a reality. I have a sense, and Joe Biden, I think one of his strengths as a candidate in 2020 was that he obviously got the Catholic community in his bones. I mean, this is someone who did speak about labor and poverty in terms that really resonated almost just by osmosis, a certain amount of Catholic social thought. The kind of milieu he grew up in Scranton, Pennsylvania, was the experience shared by a lot of Catholics. I'm a Fall River Catholic, which is like being Scranton. So I'm Fall River EJ, not Scranton Joe. But I always felt a kind of link with that, that view of the world. I think what you've got now is a party that does speak a lot about the common good. I think Walz is very interesting. He talks all the time. He uses the common good language. I think the big challenge Democrats face is that religion is a fundamentally divisive problem for them in their coalition. Because Democrats, when you think about it, include the least religious people in the country, who are those nuns, N-O-N-E-S, who don't have any religious affiliation. They overwhelmingly vote Democratic. But also Black Americans who, when you look at the numbers about their worship habits, their beliefs, their dedication to the Bible, are the most religious Americans in the world. And then you got everybody in between and diversity across Catholics, Protestants, Jews, Muslims, Hindus, because it's an Asian coalition. So Democrats have always had trouble, and this has sometimes made them tongue-tied on religion, sometimes made them reluctant to talk about it. I always felt that if Hillary Clinton, really good Methodist, whose whole approach to the world came out of her Methodism, if she had talked a little bit more about this side of her, she could have gotten those 77,000 votes she needed in those 3 states. So I think it's a very tricky problem for Democrats.
Can I follow up a little bit on that one? I think it's you clearly heard references to religion and faith at the Democratic Convention last night as well. And at the same time, it often seems that the Democratic Party, to take one example on abortion, right, has no room for Catholics who believe that both mothers and their unborn children deserve protection and care. Also has a tagline right now, mind your own damn business, that sounds much more like isolating individualism than the kind of communitarian and solidaristic themes that we see in Catholic social teaching. How do you resolve those substantive themes with Catholic social teaching, with how Democrats might talk to the faith and the faithful in this election?
I wrote a book some years ago, forgive that, but it's relevant to this, called Our Divided Political Heart, where I argued that all Americans, it's not a division among us, it's a division within us, that all Americans are torn by our dedication to individualism and our love and quest for community. Americans are both we're at times individualistic, at times communitarian. Paul Begala tells a great story. He was commenting on the book, bless him, and he said the following, that in Texas, where he grew up, there were 2 speeches that always worked. And one was, my people came down here and they were on their own. And they just they took down the trees and built their homes, and they built their farms or their cattle ranches, and they did this all by themselves. Cheers. The other speech that always worked was, my people came down here in wagon trains. They protected each other. They looked after each other. They made sure they were okay. They got here. They built a community together. First thing they built was a church, and the next thing they built was a school. And he said, always applause for that. And I think there is that division within us. So I think all of us, each of us, is a mind your own business person about something. Sure. And we sometimes disagree over what the mind your own business thing is. I do agree that it is a real problem in both parties about individualism and how we think about politics, that Democrats tend to be socially individualistic and Republicans tend to be economically individualistic. And what you need is some kind of harmony between those. But then when you hear somebody like Walz talk about his experience as a coach, his experience as a teacher, how he thinks about the community he grew up in, you do hear that communitarian strain. We can talk more about abortion later. That is I have a theory that the church needs a new approach post-Dobbs, but we can talk about that later on.
I'm sure we'll get to it. And I think, Saurabh, this is a great time to come to you, because I think a lot of your work is about resisting these strains of individualism and reviving a kind of solidaristic view of public life. Your intellectual and spiritual journey, not to reduce it, but it's brought you now to the Catholic Church, to a position of leadership among the post-liberal New Right. Within the conservative movement, you're a champion of working people and unions. You regularly call out the failures of big business and our financialized economy. Already, we've heard about Goldman Sachs tonight. You tweet positively about J.D. Vance and Pope Francis. That's an unusual combination. Early on, you reaffirmed your support for President Trump, but more recently, you've called into question his alliance with tech billionaires. You've called into question the authenticity of his support for populist working class agenda. How do you see this shaping the Trump-Vance campaign? How do you see it shaping its outcome? What is your assessment of the campaign as it tries to adapt to the changing race?
Sir, you forgive me. I want to say, I knew you'd say the Goldman Sachs thing, and good for you for saying it. That was on brand.
It was on brand. So I thought what was most exciting about the Trump phenomenon as it emerged in 2015-16, although at the time I was just your average Wall Street Journal editorial writer and was horrified, of course, by it at every step. But over time, I saw why it was happening and why it's worth listening to the Trump phenomenon. That was to the extent that he defied the Republican Party's political economic orthodoxies. In other words, Trump took over the Republican Party by barreling his way past 15 kind of conventional Republicans. And he did so by saying, for example, that I'm not going to cut your entitlements, or I'm not going to quote unquote reform entitlements, which is the kind of the perennial fetish of Wall Street fee skimmers and libertarian weirdos in this town. Like, no one else wants it. And entitlements are extremely popular, including with Republicans. And so just being able to say, hey, these New Deal programs are valuable and I'm going to keep them was pretty revolutionary at the time. Likewise, he even hinted at a public option in healthcare. You'll remember there was an exchange with Ted Cruz where he said, I'm not going to let people die on the streets. And Ted Cruz said, so you're saying socialism? And Trump just said, I'm not going to let people die on the streets. And the audience, kind of the base GOP audience, roared with approval for Trump. And of course, the bipartisan orthodoxy, that one really isn't just Republican. It was Clintonian, Bushian, Obamian on free trade. He brought that under severe critique and then began to articulate a different vision of trade with his tariffs against China. More recently, for reasons, I'll try to be brief, but for three fundamental reasons, I think he has struggled to recover that populist energy from 2016. You see that, for example, in the fact that, to me, when he says, I'm going to appoint Elon Musk to, cut down the government, given the fact that Elon, is obviously a self-interested billionaire, I think that's out of tune with the message of 2015-16. Or even on immigration, he went on a discussion with a few tech billionaires, and of course they want, cheaper tech labor, and so he told them he would support that. He would give a green card to anyone who finishes even just an associate's degree, and so on. So why is this happening? I think there's three reasons. One is what I already alluded to in my first answer, which is, to a large degree, the center-left, which is really the kind of party of government, the party of state in the United States. That's where the kind of gravity of government and state is. Granted so much of the critique. In other words, Bidenism was in so many ways Trumpism under a different aspect. In some ways, a more effective Trumpism, right? The tariffs were kept in place, decoupling from China, supply chains should be closer, CHIPS Act, CHIPS and Science Act, and so on. These were all departures from the Clinton-Obama neoliberal kind of tendency. So with that being the case, where does Trump come in to be more populist now? It's a little bit more difficult for him to stand out. Second is the fact that the relationship of the Democrats with their oligarchic wing is very different from the relationship of the Republicans with their oligarchic wing. My theory of this, which is developed in discussion with a friend who's totally not in our world, he's like a private citizen, so I won't mention him, but many segments of American capital have come to see the Democrats as the reliable party of government. And so a lot of them seek the Democrats' favor. And that gives the Democrats an ability to discipline the various elements of the donor class, whereas Republicans have a few donors and they have to like worship them, right? If Elon comes over to you, you're going to be like, Elon, we're going to name the Republican Party after you. Just give us money. And I've seen this dynamic. Like, it's the donors that hold the whip hand with respect to the Republicans in a way that's actually not the case with Democrats. It's much more complicated. They have to be responsive to the union vote, to the civil rights movement, et cetera. And it's much more of a kind of balancing of social forces. So that's the second reason. The third one, which I won't get into, is just a historic weakness of American populism going back to the Jacksonian era, where they know how to smash or to shake up an establishment, as Jackson did by destroying the Second Bank of the United States, but they struggle to then say, so how do we govern? Right? There were things that the Second Bank did that were useful, even as it was indeed a vehicle for sort of Northeastern elites. So in other words, the cry of the Western and Southern smallholders against the Second Bank was a just one, but then like, what do you do? And Jackson hadn't thought that through, and he just sort of went for this Jim Crack solution of state banking, and it was a mess, and basically the United States suffered from it, unlike other industrial states. And I think something like that is happening with Trumpism. They shook up the establishment, they unsettled it, gained some concessions from the establishment, but don't know where to go now.
Follow up a little bit on that. You say Bidenism was Trumpism in action in a sense, but I've also heard you describe it, and maybe I would think I kind of would more subscribe to this view, that it's really New Deal Democratic Party, right? It's pro-labor economic policies, and you've praised that in the Harris-Walz ticket. We've also talked about already a little bit about the fact that there's no middle ground on abortion in the Democratic Party right now. When you look at the Republican Party, on the other hand, may or may not be a pro-worker agenda, may or may not be pro-life. It's very unclear at this point. But what we do know is Trump has demonized migrants again and again and again. It's been clearly denounced by Catholic leaders. And we saw it again last night. So how should Catholic voters think about all of this? Where we are, we know we're politically homeless. How do we approach this election?
Yeah, I'm actually very optimistic about the prospects for the United States long term. I saw my friend Ross Douthat recently had a similar intuition, and I share it. I do think a new center is emerging, notwithstanding our partisan furor and notwithstanding just the utter ugliness of accusing one specific migrant community of eating cats, which is just disgusting. But notwithstanding all of that, I think a kind of consensus is emerging. Largely, we think that we want we want to kind of control globalization to a degree that we hadn't before. We want to assert the primacy of the political over markets. And you see tendencies of that kind still in the Republican Party to a degree that you didn't before, notwithstanding the critique I just gave, where I think they're not as populist as the Trumpians used to be. And again, even if you might take issue with the Goldman Sachs line, there are elements of the document that the Harris campaign published, and certainly things that Tim Walz has stood for, that hint in the same direction. So, I think for Catholics, we should seek to build the center, no matter which side of the aisle we're on. That is, when we see either party going in this solidaristic direction, reasserting the importance of the common good, reasserting the primacy of politics over markets, we should cheer them. And when we see either party going in the wrong direction, whether it's our own side or the other, we should speak out as well. And just that, and I worried. I realized that sounds kind of, you can be too precious taking that stance. It almost becomes like, I have friends in it, but the American Solidarity Party tries to do this, but it's like, join my group of 36 people, but it's not 36 people. It's lots of Americans who are in that Catholic center, even if they're not Catholic or not. They want certain,
Sure. Well, we can also
response right now.
Yes.
Yeah,
yes.
Exactly. And also, it's being salt and light, right? That's what we talk about here. And it's a great place to go to you, Nicole. So we have we often play theologians here, and we have an actual theologian, expert on Catholic social teaching, someone who thinks, writes, and speaks about the intersection of faith and public life, and does such a wonderful job on it. So help us look at this election season through the lens of Catholic social teaching. How do principles like respect for human life and dignity, solidarity, solidarity and subsidiarity, advancing the common good. How are we seeing that reflected and neglected in the election that we've been such a part of?
Yeah, that's such a great question, and honestly, you could write, a full book about any one of these principles in relation to our current election cycle. But one that's really stood out for me as a very complex one is family and community, and in part because of the way that this election and these campaigns have surfaced real divisions, not just within our country, about how we live out this principle of our calling to family, our calling of community, but the way that it's brought out the fissures and highlighted the real differences among Catholics and how we interpret commonly received teaching and even, our if you want to go, I should be the theologian on the stage, thinking about our discernment of the natural law. And any of you who are familiar with Thomas Aquinas know, of course, that's the how we. That natural law redounds to the particular, that we really are trying to navigate what it is that we discern in conscience in relation to the natural law in the context of our daily lives, which might be why my sister is, my true north on all of these things, seeing how someone is trying to navigate that in real time. But you see this manifest in questions, particularly of how we raise our children. And this one has really come home to me as a mom and as a Catholic mom in this society. I attend a parish in Charlottesville that is internally very politically diverse. I won't name the names of people who attend this parish with me, but they're, luminaries of, both parties in the way that Charlottesville things are always like, oh, it's all famous people like hanging out with each other. The real disagreements and public disagreements about what it means to care for our children, that for some of us, this is manifesting in, if my child is telling their teacher that they are transgendered, I need to know. I need to know yesterday, right? That kind of intensity around gender identity that manifests in certain corridors. For me, especially being a Coloradan, someone who came of age in the era of Columbine, but also I grew up in the inner city. We had school shootings a long time before Columbine. Nobody talks about, the kind of violence that had happened in our area. To have the kind of violence that took place in Appalachia, Georgia, called a fact of life, is incredibly offensive to our faith, to Catholic parents, to our children, to every child. And now you can kind of see where I'm shaking out in the wash here. I don't want to get too, on my high horse here, but I do think that it manifests the challenges of our current moment to think about these things in terms of, as Catholics, we don't even have to, talk about in our entire society, although we live within our society. But as Catholics, what kind of conversations do we need to be having, and what kind of dialogues, not just diatribes, but dialogues, do we need to have in order to better understand where people are coming from in these conversations?
Did you have something you wanted to?
Yeah, I wanted to thank you for that, by the way, and thank you on guns. I want to agree in part and dissent in part from what Sorab said, where I want to agree that I will be happy to support solidaristic behavior on either side of politics, and I do think there are opportunities for that. I also agree that Trump did shake up the Republican Party to a degree by challenging a certain part of the establishment. But I think where I disagree is whether I don't think Trump believes anything at all, which I think is a fundamental problem. But B, I think that when you look at what he actually did as opposed to what he said, it was radically different. He said he was going to produce a better health care plan, and he tried to repeal Obamacare and replace it with something far less. And he now, still 14 years after Obamacare, he's got concepts of a plan. He delivered on tariffs. That was one promise in that agenda. He delivered on it. He filled the regulatory agencies, including the National Labor Relations Board, with anti-union people, deregulators, and the like. He didn't pass an infrastructure bill. The main economic achievement was this giant tax cut for the kinds of people Sohrab criticizes. Not criticized as human beings, but says have too much wealth and power. So I think that is a sort of real problem on that side of politics. The other problem, which we could talk about all night, is democracy itself. Nicole and I have been involved in a project for about 6 months. I think it ended up. It seemed like a long time, and it was fun. We're part of a group that's putting out a statement in a week on Christians and democracy. And I think you've got a real argument going on among Catholics right now about our attitude toward democracy. Our stand is that where Vatican II moved in embracing democracy after a long period where the church didn't or was skeptical of democracy, that it was right to do so, and it was right to do so on biblical and Christian grounds and on the traditions of the church itself. My favorite line on democracy is Reinhold Niebuhr's line that it's an old statement, people's capacity, well, I'll quote him right, man's capacity for justice makes democracy possible. Man's capacity for injustice makes democracy necessary. That the desire to have all of us have power, every single one of us, is from our inclination toward justice. The need to limit the power of anybody who rules us comes from the capacity of human beings for injustice. And I do think underneath this election, and you asked about moving toward weird and all of that and away from democracy. Sohrab's clearly moving toward Harris because he used the word weirdo, but the
word existed.
Yeah, but I don't think that the two are incompatible. And I was really struck at the debate last night at how much she made democracy itself central to the debate.
Well, let me take
Just
that
very quickly. In the spirit of ABC's moderators last night, I should say that the AP has deleted one of its tweets about that facts of life comment. Here's the full quote. What is going to solve, this is Vance, what is going to solve this problem? And I really do believe this. Look, I don't like this. I don't like to admit this. I don't like that this is a fact of life. But if you're a psycho, et cetera, so he says, here's what I would do to stop it. But just because this is from the Poynter Institute pointing out that quote wasn't.
And I think what I find so interesting about it is I think we all here in this room can agree. I mean, and obviously you're pointing out that we all agree that this is horrific, right? And how do we bring our Catholic principles to that? And I want to get back to you, Nicole, on this question because we talked at the beginning about Francis talking about this global retreat from democracy, and his solution for it is a better kind of politics, right? He talks in Fratelli Tutti about a better kind of politics, one in service to the common good. Catholics have different, people of goodwill have different ideas about how to achieve the common good. What do we do with that as Catholics?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that the goodwill part is so important. And this is why I think, and EJ, I appreciate your rejoinder to our conversation to say, maybe in this conversation we're dealing with one candidate who's flawed and one who doesn't have a moral core that is going to say what needs to be said in order to win and serve one's interests. And it's hard for me to interpret that as being a position interested in dialogue, in participation, in goodwill. But I do not think that's everyone who supports Donald Trump. I think that there's a lot of people of goodwill who are really in conscience, which again is, you should not be disobeying your conscience, y'all. Have you read, again, I'm being my accidental Thomist self today. Have you read Aquinas on conscience? Do you know our church teachings on conscience? You really should if you haven't already really delved into that. But to really be attuned to our consciences and to be open to having discourse with one another about the implications of that for our common life. And I think that a part of what we're seeing in kind of the more mature manifestations of political discourse, wherever they are to be found in this moment, is that there's still a desire for more than just winning, more than just defeating. There's a desire to win, or as one of my teachers in the audience tonight, David Hollenbach, called intellectual solidarity. Yep. And that terminology and that concept has really stuck with me as I think not just about how I participate in public life, but even, speaking here as an educator, how I set up my classes. That when we are, and, again, we have recently been reminded that certain people in our current election think of professors as the enemy, which again is not Catholic social teaching. That is not Catholic, that is not our worldview, that professors or the intellect or questions are in any way a threat to who we are. In fact, if we can share our arguments, if we can have those moments of real discussion, real conflict, but within the context of goodwill, that really matters. And I've really enjoyed and been challenged by, but really enjoyed creating a space for that to happen in my classroom at UVA, where I do encourage my students, do not be my disciple. I do not need disciples. I am not the Lord. But write for me about the thing that matters most to you, and let me try to help you to think about it and to say it better, and to maybe become a wonderful writer like these folks here.
And that gets back to what we were talking about dialogue in the beginning. I want to pick up, maybe come to you, Kristen, pick up on something you said about democracy and what we think about it. Michael Sandel had this great essay, guest essay in the New York Times a while ago, and he said, democracy is thinking about justice and the common good together. At its best, democracy is thinking together about justice and the common good. We're going to disagree, we're going to have different opinions. In that same essay, he said, so many Americans believe that their voices aren't heard, that their work isn't respected, that the elites look down on them. 85% of Americans believe that their leaders don't care what they think, and then they lack a meaningful say in shaping the voices that govern their lives. I mean, that's remarkable that we're at that position right now. Who's going to get those votes? And are people speaking to those alienated voters? What do you think, Kristen?
Well, when you think about voters who feel that their voice isn't heard, that's such a broad category of voter that it's very hard to classify them as being particularly of one side or the other. To the extent that there are voters who felt that the quote-unquote establishment was not with them, I would say in 2016, they were ones who gravitated more toward Donald Trump. Then Donald Trump becomes president, he kind of becomes a little more of the establishment. I heard in focus groups a couple of months ago, voters who felt a little bit disillusioned with Donald Trump talking about RFK Jr. with some of the same language that they had said, I almost feel like Donald Trump is too establishmentarian now. I now feel like RFK Jr. is the one who's saying the things, he's willing to shake things up. But let's set all of that aside for a moment. I think the reason why this sense of not being heard is at the root of so many of the problems in our politics today is because if you think about our polarization right now is not because 50% of America believes one thing and 50% of America believes another, and there's no cross-pollination. At my firm, we did a survey where we asked people about 20 different questions on issues, economic and cultural, and asked people where they stood. And it turns out a lot of people choose a little of column A and a little of column B, that people are very complex. Very few, if any, people picked all of the conservative responses to all 20 questions or all of the progressive responses. So when we talk about polarization, we think of it as everybody's on opposite sides and they don't feel heard because they don't think that there's a party that agrees with them all the way. That's not what it is. What it is that people feel polarized because they feel that they are unheard and that there is another side that holds more power than they do and is uninterested in listening to them or acknowledging that they have a right to hold the views that they hold. there's a colleague of mine who works in sort of national security, and she talks about, the way we decide if another country is a threat. That they are a threat if they have the intentions and the capability to harm us. If you have the intention to harm us, but you don't have any weapons, we're not that worried about you. And it doesn't really worry me if our European allies have strong militaries. That's probably good for stability and security. It doesn't make them a threat. But when you have both of those things combined, that's a problem. And if you ask voters today, which side of the aisle do you believe has more power or is better at exercising power? People always believe it's the other side. Ask any Republicans, do you believe that your side is better at wielding power? And they go, are you kidding me? They've got Nancy Pelosi, they've got the tech CEOs, they've got all of the billionaires, they've got the media, they've got entertainment. The Democrats have all the power. We are a bunch of feckless morons who can't get our act together. And then I talk to my friends who are Democrats, and they're like, are you kidding me? I wish we had somebody like Mitch McConnell who knows how to bend the rules or break them for his own gain. And you have all the dark money, and you have all the rules bent in your favor. And so everybody believes that their side is powerless and the other side is powerful. And that leads to a sense of feeling under siege, a sense of feeling under threat, and a willingness to therefore excuse behavior that you would think is probably not okay, because you know what, we're all in this foxhole together. And I'm gonna be with the person who's gonna help fight with me from this foxhole, even if I think their tactics are maybe outside what I am morally comfortable with. And so I think that sense of being unheard is what has allowed a lot of these other kind of pathologies to pop up in our politics. Because when people feel powerless, they are more willing to excuse whatever it will take to feel a sense of empowerment again.
Thanks for that. We're going to I'm going to ask one quick question for a quick answer from Saurabh and EJ while everybody who wants to ask a question is getting ready for it. After a quick answer here, we're going to have a microphone in this aisle with a preference for Georgetown students. But very quickly, I want to ask you, and then we'll get to everybody else. There is a place where there's so much agreement among Catholic Republicans, Catholic Democrats, and it's around the child tax credit and pro-family policies, paid family leave and all of that. Is there a way that Catholics can come together and advocate around that set of issues in a way that effectively drives that result, regardless of who enters the White House? What do you think, Saurabh?
Yes, after the election, and regardless of who wins, right?
Regardless, you think it'll happen? You think it could happen?
I think it could. Even on thorny, that's I think, relatively easy one, because you already have a lot of Republican buy-in on the child tax credit. But on labor issues, you are seeing a kind of a nascent tendency among some Republicans to try to actually reach out to organized labor. Because there is a kind of fake populism on the right where it's like, I'm pro-labor because I wear plaid shirts and I drive a Ford F-150. But there can be a substantive one, and it's all about little trust-building efforts. It's like, what can labor do in a small way for a Senator Rubio and vice versa around workforce development, or things that aren't so fraught. And those can slowly kind of snowball into a deeper convergence and consensus.
How about you, EJ? Do you think after the election there's room for, first of all, for Catholic leaders to be leaders in helping drive this kind of agreement on whether it's child tax credit type policies or whether it's pro-labor policies?
Yeah, two answers on each one. I think the church should be, at all levels, absolutely at the center of these things. And all these issues should be far more important to its public witness than it is now. And there are exceptions. There are bishops out there and nuns, God bless them, who've been at the forefront of a lot of the fights for social justice, and people in a lot of the organizations. But I think this should be a centerpiece. And as I said at the beginning, all these things are about, in the end, strengthening families and helping kids have a better shot at success. In the Congress, I'm sort of divided on this. You did have Senator Michael Bennet of Colorado, who has really been fighting hard for this, along with Cory Booker and Sherrod Brown, entered into negotiations with Mitt Romney, who won't be here after this election. And they were really trying to find a way to get a child tax credit that they could agree on. And I do think that, in principle, this should be a reasonable thing for a lot of Republicans to support. But it just never happens that they put the votes there. for it. And I think that's where religious voices might actually make a difference in moving some more people on the Republican side, because it's just a basic social justice idea. Christian Democrats and Social Democrats in Europe came together on ideas like this to create a more just society over there.
And it's very popular.
And just very quickly, that I think this is 100% I agree with EJ, that we'd not treat, Evangelium Vitae as absolute, but the stuff in Rerum Novarum is like optional, right? The popes weren't economists, they're both actually, they both rest on the same kind of moral architecture, and therefore both should be treated as absolutes for Catholics.
Thank you for that. All right, any questions in the audience? Anybody have anything they'd like to ask? Anna, you have? And please identify yourself and just stand up, and I'm going to use a famous phrase by my colleague. Please phrase your question in the form of question.
Hi, I'm Leandro. I'm a freshman in college. I'm from Peru. And it was touched about how do we have all of these questions, and not everyone would choose the conservative or the liberal answer. So how do people with religious faith weigh over different principles, i.e. maybe Catholicism tells us not to lie, and Trump lies because he has been so much fact-checked. But I don't like having less control of my children, and that's what I think the Democratic Party is doing. How do people cast their votes based in different religious beliefs being sparse around different in the political spectrum?
That's a great question, and I'm going to go to our resident expert here. You talked before, right, about bringing these principles down into the particulars. So how do we make that decision when we're whether it's about a policy or approaching the voting booth or whatnot? What's a framework?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's so much that could be said. There are full courses here taught at Georgetown on precisely this matter as it should be. But I think one that is worth lifting up that I think is manifest in the different comments in really rich and legitimate ways is an attention to discerning truth. Now, that, of course, is so thin as to almost not mean something, even though we all have a very robust sense of what it means to tell the truth. To be honest, this is not, the right of any particular, culture or even a faith. We think back to Kristen's, comments about, these different religious communities in the United States who are trying to discern truth, but then what that looks like in practice is a matter, and, we're here at this, Story Jesuit University, it's a matter of discernment. It's a matter of trying to navigate a world that leads us often to making tragic choices that truly disturb the conscience, and I think that there is like the example that you offer us with maybe this issue matters to me, but this person is lying. A part of that, from a Catholic perspective, is tell the truth. Actually. No, I'll leave that to the side for now. But tell the truth is, this guiding principle. But it also matters that politics is a realm of coalitions. It's a realm of people who do not agree on everything, trying to work together to achieve common ends. And that sometimes requires, I'll amend that always requires us to cooperate with people who we might not otherwise agree on with a particular topic. But I'll just say one more thing on this, because I'm sure others want to weigh in. A colleague of mine at the Jesuit School of Theology at Berkeley, Julie Rubio, who's a fantastic ethicist and moral theologian, one concept that she offers that I think could be helpful for thinking about issues, whether it's abortion or migration, it's the concept of cooperation with the good. We often hear you cannot cooperate with evil, but what Julie Dr. Rubio has highlighted for us is that with reality, if you take a realist view of this world, how you navigate those relationships and coalitions could look really different. I find that some of the people, so I am pro-life, but some of the people most committed to the thriving of my children and creating a space for me to be a Catholic mom are people who also advocate for no restrictions on abortion. And if they're watching, I see you, I hear you. Does it make me less pro-life to say, I'm going to work with you to try to achieve a situation where we have a child tax credit, where we have, I'm a child who was, when I was a child, I was on welfare. I needed welfare for my brain development. I would not be a professor without public assistance. And there are some people who really making that point who really disagree with me on the morality of certain instances of abortion. And I think if we use this principle of cooperation with the good, it can really help us to reframe what the goal of politics is.
Thank you. This has been such a rich conversation, and I want to have one more question. I know we've gone over already, but I do want to get one more question if we can in. Anybody over here? Yep.
Actually, it kind of, Robert Christian, actually it kind of relates to what you were just talking about. If Catholic social teaching pulls us towards more populist solutions to economic problems and away from many elites, maybe more extreme social preferences, but we see virtually every populist movement in American history get tied up with xenophobia, racism, conspiracy theories, or anti-democratic impulses. What challenges does that present to Catholics who want to advance economic justice and seek partnerships in doing so, but don't want to elevate those ugly populist impulses and figures who are actively undermining democracy or attacking scapegoats or doing things like that?
Thanks for that, Robert. And I want to add political violence into that mix too, right? I mean, that's a question, a real question for us right now. Sarab, you want to start with that?
Yeah, I would just say that the populist movements, I mean, this is a complicated historical question, but they needn't reduce to their ugliest elements. I mean, arguably, the New Deal arose out of a kind of populist impulse, and yet it also was very respectful of democracy and its architects, someone like Reverend John Ryan, was at the time a combatant against someone like Father Coughlin, right? It's kind of anti-Semitism and so on. So that needn't be the case, but it's something to be alert to. And then by the same token, though, to remember that a lot of the worst kind of eugenic racial ideologies, certainly from the late 19th and early 20th centuries, they did not come from the kind of popular ferment. They were projects of elites who wanted to explain their own privilege by saying, of course, it's because of my superior, physiognomy and my genes and so on, which, by the way, is a movement that's re-emerging now, a kind of tendency that we should be very much alert to. And it's definitely not populist. It emerges from a certain part of Silicon Valley where, they don't want democratic demands on their power, so they have to explain, the people's inability to thrive in our system because of the fact that everyone's low IQ and dysgenic and so on. So I always think like elites have scarier tendencies when it comes to eugenics and racism and things like that.
Well, and I think you've called that recently the barbarian right. I mean, we've talked about that. I hate to cut this conversation short. It's been so rich and so robust, but I want to be respectful of everybody's time. Before we close, let me just preview some of the dialogues. We've got a great fall coming up. First of all, next Wednesday in Riggs Library on September 18th, we're very glad to be co-sponsoring a conversation with the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs on human rights in a divided world, Catholicism as a living tradition. It's the title of our professor, Father David Hollenbeck's new book, and he will be in conversation with some wonderful scholars. We're really looking forward to that. On September 24th, we are hosting a Salt and Light gathering for young adults to discuss young adults in this election year, rebuilding broken trust in institutions and leaders. We'll have a happy hour at 6 p.m., a dialogue at 7 p.m. at Georgetown School of Continuing Studies downtown, and then a reception afterwards at 8 p.m. So a lot of good food and drink and conversation. We'll be talking with Yuval Levin from AEI, Sister Eilish McCullough of Network Advocates for Catholic Social Justice, Justin Vassallo, who writes for Commonweal and Compact magazine, and Brandon Vaidyanathan from CUA's Institutional Flourishing Lab. And then we'll have a Latino leader gathering in October on seeking the common good in an election year, responses from U.S. Latinos. And then we'll continue after that our analysis of the election in November on key principles of Catholic social thought with David Brooks, Kerry Robinson, President of Holy Cross, Vincent Rougeau, and Sister Teresa Maya. So lots of great conversations and more coming up this fall. Really looking forward to it, and I hope you all can join us. Please visit our website for more information. Please follow up with resources at our website as well. And I want to thank, as always, my colleagues John Carr, Kim Mazik, Anna Gordon, and Christian Sunin for everything they did to bring this wonderful conversation together. And please join me in thanking tonight Saraba Mori, Nicole Flores, E.J. Dion, and Kristen Soltis Anderson.